Today's lore deep dive is brought to you by Monument Studios, who has provided all the epic music and ambiance you'll hear throughout this video. I am excited to tell you more about them along with an actual special offer for the Riches and Liches community a little later. There are some secrets that are best left hidden, knowledge that can only be suffered, concepts incompatible with the living that can never be unseen. Yet history is littered with the ghosts of those that sought the forbidden, their scattered vestiges a haunting hubris of warning to any that will take heed. In a drowned archive lost beneath Nile Dra near the Sheldamar River, sealed behind stone, spell, and the silence of countless centuries, rests one such remnant. An ancient folio once exquisitely crafted, its fragile pages lined with silver foil. There it waits, still as the dead. This tome offers no promise of arcane power or glories of the divine. On its pages lie the elegant script of a human hand, detailing the history of one named Vecna. It is not so much a literary work as an authored confession, a desperate, cathartic act to purge dark knowledge never meant for the eyes of mortals. Penned by a cleric of a forgotten order who sought not power, but a final understanding of evil, believing his faith was an adequate armor against such profanities. He was terribly wrong. The forbidden words written from a rapidly fragmenting mind tell of a blasphemous life, a son to a murdered mother, Serpentine whispers, a language primeval, of immortality through unholy rituals. With the turn of each brittle page, the once graceful script becomes chaotic, the deft coherence now broken and rambling, shifting from academic observation to panicked, twisted thoughts. The distorted words offer visions of a dread domain, a prison realm, Cavicius, a severed hand, a petrified eye, a betrayer. The remainder of this disturbing book offers only crumbling pages that hold a single broken sentence, repeated over and over, devolving into nothing more than crimson scratches, until finally the script is unreadable, fading into blood-stained smears. A hand of power, an eye of secrets, blinded by a familiar blade. The veracity of this ominous accounting lies somewhere between the borders of dark legend and apocryphal tales, so dismiss it if you must, yet it is from this abrupt silence that our discoveries will begin. Vecna is often introduced as the grand villain of the undead strain of evil, but that title is far too narrow. He has been many things: child, son, slave, tyrant, god. He exists not in defiance of order, but in the contempt of its limits. Vecna's influence is felt across the cosmos. His fingerprints are coded into the secret names of spells. His breath lingers within ineffable grimoires, and it is often the shadow of Vecna that falls across the zenith of D&D's most defining crises. And so we ask at the outset of this discovery and descent, what is the cost of knowing too much? When the last secret is yours alone, what remains? The legends of most great evils trace their roots to the nefarious realms of the outer planes, spawned from the torment of the nine hells, the bottomless chaotic depths of the abyss, distant unseen worlds across the multiverse, or even unknown dimensions of the darkly divine. But Vecna? His history shatters this mold, beginning upon the material plane and among its people, a fact that matters more than is often admitted in the lore. Vecna is not only one of the most infamous and enduring villains in all of Dungeons & Dragons, he is the blue-collar tale of a powerful undead sorcerer who carried no divine lineage, nor was anointed any omnipotence at birth. Far from it, in fact. Vecna's origin story traveled the most difficult of paths, earning every dark power, and eventually clawing his way to claim godhood. Vecna would rise from the most humble of meta beginnings, first introduced in name only in the 1976 Eldritch Wizardry supplement, serving as a wellspring where Brian Bloom would invent two magical artifacts known as the Hand and Eye of Vecna, the only remnants of an evil lich destroyed long ago. The actual name Vecna was an anagram of Vance, a nod to Jack Vance, a favored fantasy author of Gary Gygax. 3 years later, in 1979's Dungeon Master Guide for the first edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, those artifacts would be further detailed as legendary powers with expanded lore. However, at this time, the lore maintained these were all that remained of this Vecna, still considered canonically as a lich lost to antiquity. It would be another 10-year wait until the release of 1989's Dungeon Master Guide for the second edition, where we would be given hints that maybe Vecna was not long destroyed after all. This was all set up for the 1990s Vecna Lives, where the lich marks his first appearance as a living, or unliving, but active antagonist in a published adventure. Vecna's legend has continued to grow exponentially over the ensuing decades, evolving in depth and power through every edition of Dungeons & Dragons lore. He is known today by many epithets, all earned: Archlich, the Maimed God, the Whispered One, the Undying King, and the Lord of the Rotted Tower, even the Master of the Spider Throne, a moniker one can only assume does not sit well with the Spider Queen Lolth, herself a goddess. Regardless, each of these titles are the scars and stories of the Lich God. Each alludes to Vecna's lichdom, his mutilation, his domain claims over dark and forbidden knowledge, destructive secrets, betrayal, and of course, undeath. The Vecna of today has evolved into the summit of in-game evils, a supreme form of undead whose lust for power transcends even death, highlighting the awe and terror with which his followers regard him, while also igniting the righteous passions of heroic players across countless tables and adventures. Few are the dark powers across the D&D mythos whose origin story carries as much weight as Vecna's, not only because his beginnings are unique, but because the mechanisms of his hard-earned ascent, while certainly reflecting something intimately evil, are also quite intrinsic to the human condition, making them uncomfortably relatable to us mere mortals. Before the Lich, before divinity, there was first a boy, then a man. A detail often overlooked, sometimes even forgotten, in favor of his later, more infamous deeds. It would, of course, be absurd to suggest that Vecna is anything other than the most vile of evils. However, if one were so inclined, an arguable position of nurture over nature could possibly be made, positing that the genesis of the future divine Lich was not born of or necessarily destined to be inherently evil. That perhaps his unholy darkness was at least partially carved from the hardships of injustice, persecution, and the sinister influence of those that were closest to him. Later accounts would be found that cast Vecna's birth mother in a far darker light, with the Lich himself revealing that she was a woman of the purest evil, known to sacrifice animals and routinely consort with monstrous beings in her heinous ritual magic. Vecna himself would even add that it was his witness of her cruelty as a child that helped shape the man he would become in life and the tyrannical evil he would embody in undeath, serving as further, albeit biased, evidence bolstering the nature versus nurture argument of evil. The genesis of Vecna was first seated in the Greyhawk setting upon the strangely differently spelled world of Earth, dating back to oral histories of the Flan tribes, a people whose Bronze Age kingdoms once dotted the fertile river valleys of Earth's central basin. Long before the Great Migrations would give shape to the eastern region of the continent of Oric called Flannes, the walled city of Fleeth stood as a minor power in the Sheldamar Valley. Among the many Flan tribes were the Flan, an ethnic subgroup of the Flan known for their bronze skin and potent mystics. most feared for their proclivity and acumen in the dark arts of necromancy. By Vecna's time, this blasphemous Urflan tradition had been driven to near extinction by generations of what had come to be known as witch hunts by the other sects of the Flan people. Compounding this fear was the Urflan's own well-documented xenophobia and a dogmatic belief in their own spiritual superiority, which only deepened the chasm between them and the other Flan tribes. Fleeth had evolved into a theocratic state, rigid in its worship of Foltus, the god of light, order, sun and moon, and the walled city's ruling elite had officially banned any arcane practice that fell outside its strictly sanctioned doctrine, an edict enforced with a theatrical level of brutality. The spectacle of tome and scroll-burning pyres in the public square, beside the heretic mages who wrote them, had become an all-too common sight. For within the city walls it was well understood that nobles burn books because books can burn kingdoms. Into this narrow-minded world, an Urflan witch, or shaman if you prefer, named Mazel, birthed the son who would come to remember every flicker of those burning pyres. While intolerance based on ethnicity was not the defining prejudice within Fleeth, the city's inflexible social hierarchy served much the same purpose. The ruling elites, guided by their own religious doctrines, leveraged class warfare as their preferred form of bigotry. This societal structure placed Mazel and by proxy her son on the very bottom of that hierarchy in a caste known as the Untouchables. Mazel and the young boy Vecna experienced firsthand the terrible effects of this class divide, resulting in the continual crushing weight of open hostility and discrimination faced by all the Untouchables. From a meta view, this is a title and word that has become twisted with time, finding its own duality of definition and context. Calling someone untouchable in the modern days might be taken as high praise, at least in the Western world. However, the term untouchability to many cultures, namely South Asia, India, and the surrounding regions, emerged in the early 20th century as a form of social institution used to legitimize discriminatory and often exploitive practices against people belonging to certain, most often lower, social castes. Regardless, upon the world of Earth, this was an undeniable and prejudicial pejorative. The Untouchables of Fleeth were a designation reserved for only the lowest stratum of the societal ladder. Mazel, adorned with the faded tattoos of a heritage shaped by her practice of the necromantic and shamanistic magic, was permitted to exist only to perform the unclean but necessary tasks the aristocratic followers of Foltus would not, such as the embalming of the dead. It was in these sepulchral environments of the dead that the child Vecna would get his first taste of magic, taught the rudiments of witchcraft by his mother, a forbidden legacy passed down only in secrecy. Mazel would also use her taboo talents to make ends meet, an ancient side hustle if you will, as a black market medicine woman, creating powerful tonics, tinctures, and other remedies in secret, selling them in dark alleys to the wealthy elite. However, fortune would frown when Mazel found herself in the midst of nobility and scandal. Approached by a queen's chambermaid seeking remedy for the unwanted results of an adulterous affair between a princess of Fleeth and one of her guards, Mazel had no option other than to fulfill the request in this no-win scenario. The lore insists that she provided the medicine with very specific dosing instructions, but the queen, eager to resolve the situation quickly before scandal broke, tripled the dosage, resulting in the princess's death by fatal poisoning. And in a tale as old as time itself, a constant found across any civilization of any world, responsibility would be misdirected by those with wealth and status to those without, ultimately exposing and condemning the witch's forbidden practices. Blame and whatever replaced justice in the city of Fleeth was swift and severe. Within days, Mazel would find herself doused in oil and tied to an iron stake atop a pyre dreadfully similar to the many book burnings witnessed countless times before. Shame and ignorance would soon take center stage as a growing crowd gathered to hurl insults and cast their damnations, displaying the worst elements of the human condition. Condemned as a blasphemous, heretical, and unclean witch, Mazel was to be purified in the flames of Foltus. With only moments before she would be engulfed in said flames, the witch made her final prayers to her serpent deity, Mox-like, as her eyes locked onto the young Vecna. She prayed for deliverance for her son. She prayed for vengeance upon the city. Vecna, only 8, perhaps 9 winters old, was forced to watch as tongues of fire and flame consumed his mother's form, searing her final words into his young mind. Remember what they fear. It is worth noting here that the lore of later texts have continually softened the narrative of Mazel's final end, from the vivid early accounts just shared to simply noting she was executed, and eventually moving into the realm of full retcon, where some of the more modern writings, specifically those of the Vecna dossier, have attempted to spin the fate of the mother of the lich god to a more palatable exile. These are nothing more than insulting lies to some, but take from that what you will. Much of the dramatic weight of these early accounts, particularly the vivid details of Mazel's death and Vecna's coming thirst for vengeance, are primarily drawn from 2nd edition sources. These include the adventure modules Vecna Lives, Die Vecna Die, and Vecna Reborn, as well as the 2002 graphic adventure Vecna Hand of the Revenant. From these sources, 2 generally conflicting yet equally potent tales emerge concerning the exact nature of Vecna's subsequent arcane education and ascent. One of the self-taught prodigy and another of a boy guided by a dark patron known as the Serpent. Additionally, we must also consider, just for the sake of completeness, the recent 5th edition lore, specifically the writings found in the aforementioned Vecna dossier. These provide a significant retcon to the classic history, which I will at least attempt to clarify. The most prosaic of these histories posits that Vecna was entirely self-taught, a tale meant to highlight his force of will and, of course, his intellectual genius. In this telling, his mother was able to create a distraction during her execution, allowing Vecna to escape persecution. Spending years as a fugitive on the fringes of society, Vecna would delve into the occult lore of necromancy, while also stealing into the libraries of isolated wizards and academies to acquire additional arcane knowledge. Some stories go even farther, suggesting that a dark patron took notice of the child prodigy. The Chronicle of Secret Times is an ancient Greyhawk text, not without its own detractors. It was authored by the scholar Juhas of Naheli, and the pages within this purple tome claim that the young Vecna's arcane education was significantly augmented by a mysterious entity known as Mox-like the Serpent, said to have imparted powerful secrets to the young Vecna from beyond realities and never before heard by mortals. Mox-like is one of the more polarizing and quite interesting lore facets found within Vecna's origin story, deserving of further discovery, which we'll do in the next chapter. Another divergent path of history exists in the more modern accountings of 5th edition and found in the Vecna dossier of 2022. This alternative lore suggests Vecna did not escape in the aftermath of his mother's execution, that he was, in fact, taken by an order of elder wizards who, having been responsible for his mother's fate, enslaved and orphaned the boy as a menial servant and eventually a scribe. It is also in this narrative where you will find the aforementioned softening of Mazel's fate of fire into mere exile. These controversial writings paint the picture of a young Vecna feigning servitude by day while secretly he crept into their libraries by night, ink-stained fingers racing across grimoires as his brilliantly sinister mind absorbed dark knowledge forbidden to all but the most accomplished of wizards. It was during these clandestine studies that we are told Vecna first heard the disembodied voice of a dark presence, carrying promises of the power to avenge his mother if only he would embrace the hatred in his heart. The texts of the dossier are careful to imply only that these malevolent whispers might be the serpent Mox-like that was guiding Vecna's learning, while never naming the dark power outright. This, of course, introduces the desired mystery while leaving the door wide open for those scholars who insist it was all in Vecna's mind. However, perhaps the most egregious retcon found in this 5e updated telling revolves around the immediate acts to follow, specifically as it relates to changes in the timeline used to chronicle Vecna's desired retribution. The dossier writings claim that once Vecna had learned all he could from his master's books, he then unleashed his wrath upon each. The 5th edition lore posits that when the torn pages of Vecna's covert research were finally uncovered by the city's nobles, they would find only ashes, footsteps, and carnage. The servant they had misnamed Boy was nowhere to be found, and the elder wizard masters slaughtered in their sleep. This is a not insignificant alteration, implying Vecna found his measure of revenge by massacring the entire order of elder wizards who had damned his mother and placed him in forced servitude, while still not only a mortal human but also relatively young. Thus, in the 5e canon, Vecna actually took his revenge far earlier than waiting centuries as the legacy lore has documented. Regardless of the chosen source, during those formative years, Vecna was without doubt a prodigy of the arcane, whose early hardships and sinister upbringing forged in him a ruthless edge, shedding any and all morality or compassion in his single-minded quest for power. In the ensuing years, Vecna would uncover and acquire knowledge of the dark arts that few mortal wizards had ever known before or since. And despite some stark alternate routes taken by the early lore, they are each undisputed in their convergence at Vecna's eventual transformation into a future archlich of legendary power and cruelty. When it comes to hidden secrets, not all great powers are forbidden. Sometimes it's just an incredible deal. To add the bone-chilling dread of a lich's lair or the high-stakes tension of an in-game battle to your gaming table, you just need the right audio. That's why I'm excited to have Monument Studios sponsoring this video. Their Fantasy Plus app is the world's most powerful and affordable tabletop RPG audio resource. We're talking over 6,000 high-quality audio files, music, ambiance, sound effects, all at your fingertips with a downloadable desktop client for Windows and Mac. There's a reason they were fully funded on Kickstarter in under 2 hours. One low price of $4.99 a month for everything. Cancel anytime. No microtransactions. You get the whole library, period. And because I personally use, enjoy, and believe in their product, they've given the Riches and Liches community an offer that is actually special. Use the code LICHES and get 90 days of free in-app time. Just go to monumentstudios.net and use the code LICHES. Easy. You've been listening to their music for months in my videos. Now you can bring that same audio immersion to your campaigns and worlds by building the perfect soundscape with the Fantasy Plus app. And the best part is, unlike our lore discovery on Vecna, Monument won't ask for an arm and a leg, or a hand and an eye. Links are below, and thank you to Monument Studios for sponsoring this lore deep dive. Like portions of Vecna's own history, the conflicted evolution of the entity the lore calls the serpent Mox-like leaves in its wake many theories on the nature and even the existence of this symbolic, surreal, or perhaps literal dark power, each depending upon your chosen edition of scholarly writings. What makes this focused chapter so important for modern lore scholars is the need to highlight that much of that confusion is actually born of conflicts manufactured by the authored pages of those same modern writings. In fact, if one were to focus solely on the early text, specifically the 2nd edition, these murky waters become significantly more clear. Dare I say crystal. So let's start from the beginning. In the early chronicles of the 1st and 2nd edition, the serpent, as it is referred to today, was known as Mox-like in the tongue of the ancient Flan people of Greyhawk, and was an entity of godlike power, a fact not in dispute. Mox-like, as written in those times, was said to be a member of a group of the earliest nascent entities known as the Ancient Brethren. These were not gods, at least not in a conventional sense. They were fundamental principles, survivors of a previous reality, or perhaps even the architects of the current one. A scholar of the 4th edition, well versed in that edition's Dawn War canon, would find many analogues to what 4e called primordial powers, said to predate even the gods. Among those that at one time counted themselves in this ancient brethren collective are some very familiar names, including the Lady of Pain, Thurisdan, Jezerian, and others, even Asmodeus, who we must remember in this early age of the 1st and 2nd edition had not yet ascended to his own godhood. Additionally, for those that watched my deep dive on the full history of the Yugoloths, links below, the lore also hints at a possible connection between these ancient brethren and the Dradens and Bernoloths, believed by some to also be primordial-type powers who may also have existed before even the gods. Mox-like the serpent in this context represents arcane power in its purest, most amoral form, knowledge without ethics, creation without purpose, and change without direction. Sticking with the 1e and 2e text, there was little confusion about the nature or manifestation of this serpent entity, a fact evidenced by writings in both 1998's Vecna Reborn and Die Vecna Die in 2000, where Mox-like was clearly depicted as anything but a figment of Vecna's imagination. As part of Vecna's earliest teachings, Mazel told her son that the serpent gains its power by devouring the souls of those who honored it in life, a core tenet of the serpent's dogma and an act that was said witnessed by all who watched her own execution. The tutelage of such a being would have granted Vecna far more than just spells. The serpent, Mox-like, would have taught him the underlying encryption of reality, what some texts refer to as the language primeval, an important but often overlooked facet of arcane studies and the mastery of its deepest potential. This is the source code of the planes, the fundamental magic that even deities must obey. By learning to decipher facets of this language primeval, Vecna was not simply mastering magic, he was learning to manipulate existence. This early instruction provides one of the very few logical explanations for Vecna's later reality-defying feats, such as his ability to breach the defenses of Sigil, an exploitation that should have been impossible for any deity. Nonetheless, it was not until the 3rd edition text where some scholars would begin to cast doubt on Mox-like's existence, with language that skewed towards the implication that the serpent might be nothing more than the manifestation of Vecna's own magic, or worse still, the whispers of his own madness. This narrative shift only became more emboldened in a 2006 article penned in Dragon Magazine number 348, where new, never-before-seen theories were suggested, or dare I say invented. These include the compounding fringe belief suggesting Mox-like may be the conflation of the Serpent of Asmodeus, yet another fringe theory, as well as other suppositions that involve the world serpent, and the truly insulting insanity of Vecna's mind, each loose hypothesis insinuating at some level that the serpent simply does not and never did exist. But the confusion today is real. In fact, if you look on page 28 of Dragon Magazine number 359, which incidentally was the last print issue of the magazine, you will see that the identity of the serpent is among a list of great unsolved mysteries of D&D. Even Vecna's own claim that Mox-like is a real entity and was his tutor in the dark arts is viewed by many scholars as a convenient mythology used by Vecna just to add a dash of the divine to his ordinary accumulation and gathering of knowledge. Regardless, the sheer depth and magnitude of the arcane secrets Vecna would come to command cannot be ignored and undeniably adds significant weight to any concept of aid being given by some form of external dark power. But the truth is, only Vecna really knows, and he has no intention or need to provide any clarity to the cloudy mystique offered by such a perfectly complex history. The trail of Vecna's mortal origin story would re-emerge upon the lands years later with the young, talented mage, now an archmage of unrivaled power. However, as Vecna's command of mortal magic reached its apex, it would be the frailties of his physical form that would threaten to steal the vast knowledge and dark secrets he had worked so hard to acquire. Viewing mortality as an unacceptable limitation, Vecna's next conquest was less a choice than a necessity, and it would be his defiance of the physical form that drove him to sever his ties to the mortal coil. Vecna would seek to unlock the secrets of immortality found in undeath, to become a lich. While common in the modern lore of today, it must be acknowledged that according to legacy Greyhawk lore, Vecna is widely considered to be the first mortal ever with the will and, most importantly, the cryptic knowledge to undergo such a transformation. The method itself would be hinted at starting with an obscure reference to certain conjurations in the first edition Monster Manual all the way back in 1977. As the lore evolved, the details of this ritual of undeath would continually be elaborated upon. First, in a Dragon Magazine number 26 article titled Blueprint for a Lich, with further details being found in such text as the first edition adventure Lords of Darkness from 1988, Van Richten's Guide to Liches in 1993, the Book of Vile Darkness in 2002, and Libris Mortis, the Book of the Undead in 2004, among many others. I've covered all the vile details of this unholy ritual extensively and deeply on this channel in more than a few videos, so if you seek those corrupting specifics, I have several links provided below. However, someone had to be the first to open that morbid door, and the majority of lore scholars agree that from a mortal perspective, Vecna is the most likely candidate to willingly sacrifice his living body and soul in a bid to breach beyond the boundaries of life and into the domain of undeath. Yet the lore written from this ancient age leaves unclear the precise method by which Vecna would unlock the ritual magics required to achieve his profane transformation, and there exist no less than 3 distinct, contested, and often contradictory theories of this occult lore. The first, and perhaps most straightforward account, is also the most unlikely, suggesting that Vecna sought the patronage of a greater power. In this hypothesis, turning to the Prince of Undeath himself, the demon lord Orcus, a dark power who has long held the secrets to lichdom as part of his own foul portfolio, and over the millennia has become in many ways the go-to sponsor for countless liches that would later follow in Vecna's wake. This would require Vecna to strike a grim bargain with the demon prince, and the theory claims the would-be lich may have offered some unrecorded service or tribute in exchange for the highly prized dark ritual knowledge of lichdom. While both logical and even compelling in its simplicity, placing Vecna within a known hierarchy of evil, aligned with a dark power that would come to be known for offering many such sinister sponsorships, still, to most scholars, and certainly the cultists that follow Vecna, these claims hold no merit under scrutiny, sitting fundamentally at odds with Vecna's own cult of personality. The idea of Vecna becoming indebted and on some level subordinate to a rival, willingly, especially a demonic power of such chaotic brute force as Orcus, is simply not compatible with Vecna's obsessive need for self-reliance and absolute control. Further, even their philosophies on the purpose of undeath are diametrically opposed. Where Orcus champions undeath as a state of mindless servitude, anarchy, and eternal consumption, Vecna seeks to harness undeath for his own infinite accumulation of knowledge and power. And for Vecna to find himself beholden to a being whose entire ideology he disdains feels like a conceptual bridge too far. When reviewed by most scholars, this theory comes across as nothing more than likely rumor perpetuated by the cult of Orcus, their attempt to claim a fraction of Vecna's infamy for their own master. A second, more obscene thesis certainly finds strong alignment with Vecna's established character as both callous and cruel. This lore holds that Vecna did not learn the ritual of lichdom at all. He invented it. Positioning the lich as a malevolent pioneer in the necromantic sciences, this theory offers that Vecna acquired the ritual knowledge through decades of horrific experimentation, including the sacrifice of hundreds, if not thousands, of living subjects. Profane writings hint that Vecna descended upon entire villages, regarding their inhabitants as little more than personal lab rats used to further his unholy discoveries, biological components dissected, analyzed, and discarded for the dark wisdom each might yield in death. If these accountings are believed, Vecna succeeded in systematically unraveling the magics inherent to the miasma of undeath, and did so at the expense of the living, siphoning power from planes and channeling it through countless failed vessels until he had finally perfected a ritual of unparalleled and impious evil. The third and final supposition relies strongly on the belief that the serpent Mox-like exists as a dark power of godlike ability, suggesting that the secret of undeath was the ultimate and final lesson imparted to Vecna by his primordial mentor. Mox-like, as the personification of arcane magic, would possess knowledge that transcends the understanding of both mortals and, with rare exception, even gods. In this context, the ritual of lichdom could be viewed as a manipulation of the fundamental laws of existence, including the natural cycle of life, death, and rebirth. And for believers in this hypothesis, Mox-like would be among a few select entities to possess such knowledge that likely existed before those fundamental laws were even codified. This explanation, if true, would elevate Vecna's transformation from a personal act of selfish ambition into an event of cosmic significance, positioning Vecna as the chosen instrument of a power far older than even the current pantheon of gods. However, for the flexible-minded, these accounts need not be mutually exclusive. Perhaps it is conceivable that Vecna's own depraved research laid the groundwork, and that Mox-like provided the final insights needed to make the ritual stable. Regardless of the exact method, the result was a paradigm shift in the nature of undeath, with Vecna blazing a trail that would be followed by countless liches in the millennia to come. But don't let that fool you. Vecna is different, something that will become all too obvious as we near the end of this Part 1 stage of our expedition. Vecna was certainly not the first undead, yet he was arguably the first of his kind, a new breed of apex undead evil. While many undead variants existed before him, each were typically the direct creations of gods, the primordial forces, or the far more mundane acts of animating a lifeless husk. Vecna's achievement showcases an almost incomprehensible intelligence, innate power, and a force of will, each required for a mortal to carve such a path to immortality, and in doing so, showing the way forward. An achievement for which dark wizards, unholy clerics, and blasphemous necromancers across the multiverse owe Vecna a sinister debt of gratitude. Vecna was likely the first. Vecna is the most powerful lich ever known or even rumored. Vecna occupies rarefied air as one of the few elite mortals to achieve godhood. And yet, while these are all exceptional accomplishments of evil to place at the top of your resume or CV, that is not what makes Vecna different. That distinction is held by Vecna's most enduring of mysteries, unique to his lichdom and that has never been adequately addressed. I speak on the conspicuous absence of Vecna's phylactery across the literature and lore of the Lich God. No rumors of its location, not even a hint as to its shape or form. Heck, even the most cryptic references that Vecna even has a phylactery are difficult to find. And that, as any scholar who even dabbles in the lore of the undead knows, would break the known process of lichdom. For all other liches, the phylactery is not only required, it is the absolute center of their existence. A physical object enchanted with abhorrent and impious magic, crafted to become the vessel that stores and safeguards the lich's soul, becoming the anchor for regeneration, and without deviation, the lich's most prized possession. The phylactery is, for all intents and purposes, the lich's greatest strength and their most dire vulnerability. Yet the phylactery of Vecna has never been mentioned in any text across any edition with any detail. This has led to intense speculation. Did Vecna discover a form of lichdom that is in fact different from the ritual shared among the common liches by dark powers such as Orcus and Kiran Sali, a new path to the immortality of undeath that transcends the need for a physical anchor? From the in-lore perspective, this absence suggests a few new theories. Perhaps Vecna's own undeath must be of a higher order than that of his imitators. The removal of a well-known, firmly established traditional weakness of lichdom. That, or he is just really good at hiding it. Perhaps this is because of his status as a deity. Plausible, certainly in 5e, but what about the editions where he was not a god? Looking through the less rosy meta lens, I think it's safe to say that what started as a measure of ambiguity, used as a means to simply ensure that mechanically, the granddaddy of D&D liches would never truly be killed before the game's authors wanted, has now, with the more modern text, specifically the release of the Vecna dossier and Eve of Ruin sourcebook, we've seen a trajectory change in the evolution of at least Vecna, for now, that in and of itself may not seem tremendously controversial, but does set the table for more far-reaching implications. To make this point, all we need to do is review Vecna's 2022 pre-God stat block. And in doing so, one will instantly notice the complete removal of the phylactery replaced by a trait called Undying, which states, and I'm quoting now, "If Vecna is slain, his soul refuses to accept its fate and lives on as a disembodied spirit that fashions a new body for itself after 1d100 years." On the surface, this may be nothing more than a deliberate canonical codification of Vecna's divinity, transforming him from the most powerful of countless common liches into a deific figure no longer required to conform to such mundane devices or the constraints and vulnerabilities found in the established rules of undeath. And if that change is limited to undead gods, then bravo, excellent change. However, every soul coin has two sides, one potentially casting doubt that this change stops at just the divine. There have been cryptic but notable comments from D&D designers that warrant some concern while pointing to cultural forces entirely outside the lore narrative. And we cannot and should not, in my opinion, ignore the context in which this change was made. The word phylactery is a source of long-standing criticism, viewed by some as an appropriation of the term for tefillin, a real-world sacred object used in the practice of Judaism. For many decades, the game has used this word to describe its artifact of pure evil, a context that is, to some, culturally insensitive. This has naturally led to considerable speculation about the designer's broader intent with Vecna's loss of the phylactery in the 2022 stat block. Is this a singular narrative choice meant only to cement Vecna's status as a divine evil? Or does it represent the Trojan horse of first steps into a larger, system-wide retcon for all liches? What is undeniable is that this change offers a potential, if unconfirmed, foothold for the game's designers to move away from what they might view as a problematic terminology. It's not like we don't have precedent to give pause: the shelving of the dark sun setting, replacement of race with species, removal of the always evil alignment from humanoid characters. It must be acknowledged, of course, that the wider significance, if any, for this evolution of Vecna remains to be seen. Only future publications will reveal whether all liches will eventually follow a similar model of undeath and a lack of a phylactery, or if it is Vecna alone that has shattered the chains that will forever bind his inferiors. And on this small note of discord, we leave Vecna at the precipice. A mortal's grasp for immortality has paid its final, terrible dividend. Having shed his flesh, twisting the cycle of life and death, Vecna has become, with apologies to Sakatha, Caius, and their ilk, perhaps the multiverse's first and greatest arch-lich. But as any good tyrant knows, achieving power and dominion is one thing. Keeping it is another matter entirely. This was only part 1 of our descent, having only scratched the surface of Vecna's resume of ruin. In part 2, we will chronicle the building of a dark empire that spanned millennia, Vecna's tyrannical reign as a Lich King from the vile architecture of the Rotted Tower, and the terrible siege he would unleash upon the very city that set his path forward. We'll also uncover not 1 but 2 legendary betrayals that would cost him more than just his flesh, do a deep dive into the infamous artifacts he quite literally left behind. We might even find time to explore his imprisonment in a domain of dread built just for him. Special thanks to my channel and Patreon supporters who make these long-term videos possible, and to Monument Studios for creating such amazing audio and sponsoring this video. Don't forget to use the special code LICHES at monumentstudios.net to get 90 days of access to their Fantasy Plus app completely free. And thank you for watching. Let's do it again real soon. Until then, take care, my friends.